Mamdani just promised to call President Trump before taking office. Think about that for a second. A man, once branded by Trump as a little communist, now reaching across the aisle to build a relationship with him. It's not a skit. It's not satire. It's the new political reality of New York City. And it tells us far more about the future of leadership than it does about politics. Today I want to explore what this phone call really represents. Not just for Mamdani, but for the changing nature of power, communication, and the fine line between conviction and compromise. Let me paint you a picture. New York City just elected someone most political insiders didn't see coming. Zoran Mamdani, a progressive firebrand, a democratic socialist who spent years rallying against establishment politics, won the mayoral race in what many are calling a political earthquake. His campaign was built on promises to upend the status quo, to challenge power structures, to represent the voices that had been shut out for too long. And now, before he's even sworn in, he's publicly announcing that he'll be reaching out to the White House, to Donald Trump. You might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, here's the thing. When someone who's built their entire political identity on opposition suddenly extends a hand to their biggest critic, it's either brilliant strategy or political suicide. Sometimes it's both. Mamdani framed it simply. He said, he holds a responsibility to the 8.12 million people of New York City, and that means being open to working with anyone, no matter what disagreements exist. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, even noble. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find layers of calculation, risk, and a kind of pragmatism that's becoming increasingly rare in American politics. Think about what Trump represents to Mamdani's base. To many progressives, Trump is the embodiment of everything they oppose, policies they view as harmful, rhetoric they find divisive, a worldview fundamentally at odds with their own. So when Mamdani says I'm going to call Trump, he's not just making a phone call, he is making a statement about the kind of leader he wants to be. And that statement is complicated. Some will see it as maturity, others will see it as betrayal. But here's where it gets interesting. Trump hasn't exactly been sitting around waiting for progressive mayors to call him. In fact, he's made it abundantly clear over the years that he's willing to use the power of the Ponics federal government to influence cities he views as hostile. Funding can be threatened. Federal support can be withdrawn. The relationship between city and federal government isn't just symbolic, it's financial. New York City relies on federal dollars for everything, from infrastructure to social programs. If that relationship's sour, real people feel real consequences. So when Mamdani says he's reaching out, it's not just about good manners, it's about leverage. It's about recognizing that in the game of governance, you sometimes have to engage with people you'd rather not, because the alternative is worse. Trump holds cards that Mamdani needs. And whether Trump chooses to play nice or double down could shape the next 4 years of New York's trajectory. Now, Trump's side of this equation is equally fascinating. He is a man who's built a brand on strength, on not backing down, on labeling his opponents and never letting them forget it. Calling someone a communist in American politics isn't a casual insult. It's a branding exercise. It sticks. It defines. So for Trump, taking a call from Mamdani is a win. Either way. If he's gracious, he looks magnanimous above the fray. If he's dismissive, he reinforces his base's view that progressives are all talk. He's playing a game where he controls the narrative, no matter what moved makes. But let's zoom out for a moment and ask a bigger question. What does it mean when two people who fundamentally disagree recognize they need each other? In business, we call that a partnership of necessity. You don't have to like your supplier. You just have to make sure the supply chain works. You don't. We have to agree with your competitor on everything. But sometimes you collaborate because the market demands. Politics, at its core, operates on similar principles. The question is whether voters, especially Mamdani's voters, will see this as savvy leadership or as selling out. This is where the generational divide becomes really clear. If you've lived through decades of political compromise, you know that idealism often crashes against the rocks of reality. You've seen leaders who promised purity end up accomplishing nothing because they refuse to engage with the system. But if you're younger, if you voted for Mamdani because he represented a break from the old ways, this phone call might feel like the beginning of disappointment. It's the age-old tension between those who want revolution and those who want results. And here's the thing, both sides have a point. Revolution without strategy is just noise. Strategy without principle is just careerism. The trick, the incredibly difficult trick, is finding the balance. Mamdani is attempting to walk that line. Whether he succeeds depends on how he frames the conversation, what he's willing to fight for, and what he's willing to let go. Let me tell you why I find this moment so compelling. It's not really about Trump or Mamdani as individuals. It's about what this interaction reveals about leadership in a fractured society. We're living in a time where people increasingly live in separate information worlds, different news sources, different social media feeds, different realities. In that environment, reaching across the divide isn't just difficult, it's almost countercultural. It's easier to stay in your camp, rally your base, and ignore everyone else. But that approach doesn't fix roads. It doesn't fund schools. It doesn't solve homelessness or crime or infrastructure decay. Governance, real governance, requires dealing with people you don't like. It requires phone calls you don't want to make. It requires swallowing your pride and asking, what can we accomplish together that I can't accomplish alone? Now, this story doesn't exist in a vacuum. Mamdani has a history that complicates this narrative. Not long ago, he made headlines for saying he would potentially arrest Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu if he entered New York City. He was responding to an international arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, something that stirred massive debate about international law, about justice, about the role of cities in global politics. On the surface, it sounded bold, even heroic to some. But here's the catch. Under U.S. federal law, specifically something called the American Service Members Protection Act, local authorities can't enforce ICC warrants. It's not a matter of opinion. It's legally impossible. So, Mamdani made a promise he couldn't keep. And that's a problem. Not because of the intent behind it, but because it raised questions about whether he understands the limits of his power, or worse, whether he's willing to say things that sound good, even if they're not grounded in reality. One of his political opponents, a city councilor, publicly called him out on this, even going so far as to invite Netanyahu to New York, just to make a point. It was political theater, sure, but it was effective theater. It painted Mamdani as someone who might be more interested in rhetoric than results. And that brings us back to the phone call. Maybe, just maybe, Mamdani learned something from the Netanyahu controversy. Maybe he realized that old statements without the ability to follow through don't build credibility. They erode it. Perhaps this approach to Trump is his way of signaling that he's comprehended the distinction between campaigning and governing, that he comprehends the distinction between inspiring a crowd and managing a city of millions. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe he's just doing the math. Trump is president. New York needs federal backing. The relationship matters. So you make the call, you play the game, and you hope it buys you enough goodwill to protect your city from the most likely outcomes. Now, here's where the Elon in me could not help but draw a parallel. When I think about the construction of something, whether it be a company, rocket, electric vehicle, I think about dependencies. What do I need that I don't control? Who holds the keys to resources I can't manufacture? Myself? And then I figure out how to either build those capabilities or negotiate access. Politics works the same way. Manny doesn't control federal funding. He doesn't control national policy, but he does control the tone of the relationship, and political tone, as in business, can be the difference between hostility and partnership. The media, of course, has had a field day with this. Headlines frame it as either a savvy move or a surrender, depending on which outlet you read. Some praise him for being pragmatic. Others charge him of abandoning his principles before he's even taken office. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. He's doing what he thinks he has to do. Furthermore, the question of whether it performs. But I want to push on something deeper here. We talk a lot about leadership and authenticity. We say we want leaders who are genuine, who say what they mean and mean what they say. But we also want leaders who get things done. And sometimes those two things are in tension. Being authentic might mean refusing to compromise, but getting things done often requires compromise. So, which do we value more? And how do we judge leaders who have to navigate that tension every single day? Money is betting that his voters, or at least enough of them, will understand that talking to Trump doesn't mean agreeing with Trump, that building a working relationship doesn't mean abdicating your beliefs, that you can be willing to work with others while remaining willing to fight when necessary. He's betting on nuance. And in a political environment that rewards simplicity and punishes complexity, that's a risky bet. Think about what happens if he's wrong. If his base sees this as weakness rather than wisdom, his political capital evaporates before he's even begun. If Trump uses the call as an opportunity to embarrass him publicly, he looks naive. And if the relationship produces nothing tangible, he's sacrificed credibility for optics. Those are real risks. But the alternative, refusing to engage at all, carries its own risks. It paints him as inflexible, as someone who'd prefer to be correct, to be successful, and voters, especially voters dealing with real problems in their daily lives, tend to lose patience with leaders who prioritize ideology over outcomes. Let's talk about the information environment for a moment, because it shapes how this entire story gets told and understood. We're living in an era known as an echo chamber. You probably feel it yourself. You turn on one news channel and hear one version of events. You flip to another, and it's like they're describing a different planet. Social media algorithms show you content that reinforces what you already believe. And slowly, gradually, we stop having shared facts. We stop having a common starting point for conversation. This matters for story because, you're depending on where you get your news, hearing completely different narratives about what this phone call means. He is praised as in some areas, mature leader who understands that governance necessitates building bridges. In others, he's being mocked as a hypocrite who talked tough during the campaign, but folded the moment real power came into focus. Both narratives can coexist, reinforced by completely separate information ecosystems, and never actually intersect. And here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody really wants to say out loud. Sometimes the news itself becomes part of the problem. Take what happened lately with significant broadcasters. The BBC had to apologize after it came out that they'd edited footage of Trump in a way that misrepresented what he'd said. A speech he gave was edited by them in ways that changed the meaning and then presented it as if it were the full, accurate version. When it was, executives quit after learning about it. The apology was issued by the organization. Trump demanded compensation, which they refused to pay, but at least there was some recognition that something had gone wrong. Now, compare that to what happens in American media. How often do we see corrections that actually matter? How often do broadcasters face real consequences for getting stories wrong? Not by accident, but through selective editing or framing that serves a narrative rather than the truth. The answer is not very often. In fact, journalists who push stories that later turn out to be misleading or outright and false often suffers no repercussions at all. Sometimes they get promoted, sometimes they win awards. The system of rewards is broken, and this matters for our story, because Mamdani exists in this media environment. Every word he says will be clipped, framed, interpreted, and reinterpreted through different lenses. The phone call with Trump, if it happens, will be reported as either statesmanship or surrender, depending on who's reporting. And the people of New York, the 8.12 million people, he says, he's serving, will have to navigate all that noise to figure out what's actually happening. This is exhausting. By the I do not know if anyone discusses how exhausting it is to live in a time when you can't trust that what you're being shown is complete or accurate. It wears people down. It improves them cynical. And cynicism, while is destructive, even when justifiable at times, it makes people stop believing that change is possible, that leaders can be genuine, that cooperation can happen. And once people stop believing those things, democracy as a whole begins to deteriorate. So when someone like Mamdani says he's going to reach out to Trump, part of what he's doing is trying to cut through that noise. He's trying to demonstrate, through action rather than rhetoric, that it is still possible to work together, that you can disagree fundamentally on policy and still pick up the phone, that you can think someone's approach is wrong, and continue to collaborate on a few things that align with your interests. It's a small gesture, but in a world where everything is amplified and distorted, even small gestures carry symbolic weight. Now, let's zoom out to the temporarily on the global stage, because the Netanyahu controversy I mentioned earlier links to something much bigger. We're in an era where international institutions, organizations like the International Criminal Court, is attempting to assert authority over national leaders. They issue arrest warrants. They make declarations about justice and accountability. And some people see this as progress, as the world finally holding powerful people responsible for their actions. But others see it as overstep their bounds, as unelected bodies strive to overthrow sovereign nations by imposing their will. The United States has never been part of the ICC. There are particular justifications for that, mostly concerned with issues, sovereignty, and the potential for politically motivated prosecutions. The law I mentioned earlier, the one that makes it impossible for Mamdani to arrest Netanyahu, even if he wanted to, exists because the U.S., decades ago, the government decided that American officials and allies wouldn't be subject to international courts. You don't recognize. You can concur or disagree with that position, but it's the reality. Mamdani's statement about arresting Netanyahu was likely motivated by genuine conviction. He was responding to concerns from constituents who see the conflict in the Middle East through a particular lens, who want their leaders to take strong moral stances, but good intentions don't override legal constraints. And the gap between what Mamdani promised and what he could actually deliver became a liability. It made him look either uninformed or willing to make promises he knew were empty. Neither is a good look. Trump, on the other hand, has been vocally supportive of Israel's leadership. He moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. He broke normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab nations. His administration was clear about where it stood. So, when Mamdani made his statement about Netanyahu, he wasn't just wading into international politics. He was positioning himself in direct opposition to Trump's foreign policy legacy, which makes the upcoming phone call even more interesting. How do you have a constructive conversation with someone when you've publicly signaled that you'd arrest one of their most important allies, given the chance? The answer is, you focus on what you can control. You talk about the issues that matter to your city. You make the case for why federal support is important. You try to find common ground, even if it is small, and you wish that the conversation stays professional rather than personal. It's not very pretty. It's not the stuff of inspiring speeches, but it's the work of governing. There's something else happening here that's worth naming. We're seeing a merging of two very different communication styles. Mamdani came up through activism, through organizing, through movements built on protest and disruption. His political language is shaped by that world. It is enthusiastic, it's moral, it's designed to mobilize people who feel powerless. Trump, on the other hand, came up through business and the media. His method of communication is direct, often blunt, designed to dominate the conversation and control the story itself. He doesn't do nuance, he does branding. When these two styles collide, which is what will happen on that phone call, something interesting occurs. Either they find a way to translate between their languages to meet somewhere in the middle, or they talk past each other, and the call becomes a formality that accomplishes nothing. My guess is it will be somewhere in between. They'll exchange pleasantries. They'll acknowledge their differences. They will then proceed, each asserting that the interaction was whatever they needed to mean for their respective audiences. But here's what I think is the real story that lies beneath everything. We're watching a generational shift in how leadership is comprehended. For much of the 20th century, political leadership was about institutions, about processes, about working within established systems. You climbed the ladder, you paid your dues, you learned the rules, and then you played by them, or at least appeared to. That model is breaking down. People don't trust institutions the way they used to. They don't think that adhering to the procedure results in positive outcomes. They want leaders who feel authentic, who speak like real people, who seem to understand to their frustrations. Mamdani represents a version of that shift. He's young, he's ideologically clear, he speaks the language of change, but now he's figuring out what each disruptor is. Discovers eventually that once you're inside the system, you have to decide whether you intend to demolish it or try to make it work. And burning it down sounds romantic until you realize that millions of people depend on that system, working, at least in part, to get every day of their lives. Trump, in his own way, represented a similar disruption. He ran as an outsider. He attacked the establishment. He had promised to drain the swamp, and then he governed, sometimes effectively, and sometimes chaotically, but always in a way that kept people's attention. What Mamdani might be realizing is that the outsider energy that wins elections doesn't always translate to effective governance. At some point, you have to, even if you don't, make the system work. Enjoy the system. So what does this teach us about leadership more broadly? I think it teaches us that leadership is fundamentally about managing tensions. The tension between what you believe and what you can accomplish. The tension between the expectations of your supporters and the limitations of reality. The tension between being self-aware and being efficient in a position requiring compromise. The leaders we remember, the ones who actually changed things, weren't the ones who were perfectly consistent. They were the ones who figured out how to navigate those tensions without forgetting what mattered most. Lincoln worked with rivals. Roosevelt made deals with people whose politics he despised. Effective leadership has always required the ability to hold your principles in one hand and pragmatism in the other, and somehow make them work together. The difference now is that every conversation is public, every compromise is scrutinized, and the space for nuance has shrunk dramatically. Mamdani is trying to function in that setting. Whether he succeeds will depend less on the recording phone call itself and more on whether he can explain to his constituents why making that call was necessary without indicating that he has abandoned his work stands for. Which brings us to the real question. What happens next? Assuming the call happens, assuming it's civil and professional, what changes? Does Trump suddenly become supportive of New York City's priorities? Probably not. Does Mamdani suddenly moderate his positions to align with Trump's preferences? Also probably not. But what could alter is the tone. What might? Willingness to adapt to the future conversations when issues arise. What might change is the possibility, however, that when New York needs something, it is so small from Washington, the request gets heard, rather than dismissed out of hand. That's not a dramatic transformation. It's not the stuff movies are made of. But it might be enough. It might be the difference between a functional relationship and an actively hostile one. And in administration, particularly in a system as complex as the American federal structure, functional relationships are crucial. I want to close with a thought that's been on my mind throughout this entire exploration. We live in a time that rewards outrage, that rewards taking the most extreme position and defending it loudly, that rewards us for erecting barriers between us and them, whoever them happens to be. And in that environment, reaching out, extending a hand to someone you've criticized and who's criticized you, takes a particular kind of courage. It's courage to take the chance of appearing weak, the courage to prioritize outcomes over optics, the courage to believe that communication, even difficult communication, is better than silence. Maybe that's what this phone call represents. None of the friendship, agreement, or even inevitably reverence, but the acknowledgement that in a democracy, in a system where power is shared and contested, you have to talk to people you disagree with. You have to find ways to coexist, to cooperate on the edges, even when you're opposed at the center. That's not surrender. That's not betrayal. It's the realization that alternative, complete breakdown of communication serves no one. History doesn't reward purity. It rewards people who solve problems, who built things, who made life tangibly better for the people they served. And solving problems requires dealing with complexity, with contradiction, with uncomfortable compromises. Manny is learning that lesson in real time. Trump learned it from a different direction, but learned it nonetheless. And the rest of us get to watch and decide what kind of leadership we actually want. Do we want leaders who make us feel good with their rhetoric, or do we want leaders who make things work, even if the process is messy and imperfect? I know which one I'd choose. Additionally, if you've ever enough time to see some political cycles, you know which one actually delivers. If you found this conversation thought-provoking, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Would you agree that Mamdani's calling Trump is genuinely building bridges, or just political theater? I read each one. Comment, and your thoughts help shape what we explore next. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you in the next.